Hey guys, what's up? This is Simagrin. Last night I ran an Eclipse Phase game, and I wanted to take the opportunity to share with you some things that I tried in the game, some new techniques that I had used that I've never used before, and I thought they worked well. So here, if you would indulge me, I would like to share with you some of those things that I tried. So this game, I've been running it for about a few months now. So the challenge in a game like Eclipse Phase is there are a lot of different things for characters to do. Some characters are combat oriented. You got hacker types. You have scientists. How do you engage all of these characters in an action scenario where a character's strong suit might not be fighting or doing some kind of physical activity, right? How do you help create that narrative, especially through a tool like Roll20? In which you have the opportunity to use sound and visuals to tell the story. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. So there are a few scenarios, and I'm going to show you the first one. Here's the first one. My characters. So I have a tense standoff that's taking place, and I've set this up with my Roll20 scene. I have the background image, right? My characters are in some kind of spaceport or space hangar. There's one group up here. And then you have a group down here. The group up here, they are actually in a ship that is in this cargo bay. And then the characters here are outside of that, and they want to go connect back with the characters on the ship. But between them are these soldiers, Jovians actually. This is Eclipse Phase again. So that's a tense, dramatic standoff. And that scene can happen however it may. But let's say this can be resolved through diplomacy, and combat has to ensue. How do we portray that? Well, in a fantasy game that I might run, like I'm running Song of Ice and Fire now, Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. In that kind of game, right, it would make sense to bring that to a tactical map. But in Eclipse Phase, I didn't want to spend as much time building terrain as I would in a fantasy game, because I spend a lot of time doing. You may have seen my other videos. I do a lot of terrain and building maps and things like that. I didn't want to spend so much time doing that for Eclipse Phase, for this kind of sci-fi game. I wanted to try another method. So check this out. Let me show you what I've done here. First, let's move these characters out of the way. Just a little bit, and I'll show you why. So on my GM layer, I've actually built an entire tactical map. And I'm going to select all that in my GM layer, and I'm throwing that on the map layer here. So here we go. So boom, I have just turned this scenario into a tactical one. Let me expand my map here. So what do we have? We have a situation where I can now describe and visually show in a simple way, and I think an effective way, what a character might want to do in combat. So I've just used lines, I've used Roll20's drawing features here to draw a very basic skeleton of a hangar, right? There's cargo containers, there are ships, there's big hangar doors, there are stairs leading up to a catwalk. And my characters can navigate that. I've used colors to visually represent things, right? Blue for friendlies for the characters and friendly NPCs, and red obviously for the enemy in this scenario, the Jovians in this particular case. And then you have these gray markers for civilians or any kind of neutral party. Got some obstacles here, cargo containers for cover. I have these labeled objects, industrial exoskeletons if a character wants to get clever and maybe use those as part of the combat. So simple. And this did not take me hours to do, as I might spend doing a D&D map, let's say, or a Song of Ice and Fire map. The background image is still there to visually tell that story. In fact, I could even do something like this. Let me see if I have this set up. I can put kind of a dark filter over it, so it's easier to see. So that's an option. I like to do this for the maps that I overlay these tactical maps on. I like to put that dark film over things. Just create an image, a black square in PowerPoint or something like that, and add some transparency to it, overlay that on top. So that's what I've done here to make the tactical scenario a little easier to see. You don't have to do that. I like to do that. And I've only used this method a few times, and I'm really experimenting with how I can improve it. What I really don't want to do is get to the point where I'm spending so much time trying to add detail to this map that I'm kind of ruining the point of it, of keeping it simple like this. And I think it's in line with Eclipse Phase, right? It looks a little sci-fi. In Eclipse Phase, everyone's, for the most part, kind of meshed together in these various networks, so it makes sense that maybe they see scenarios like this in their own minds. So it's not a far stretch to kind of have this sci-fi-ish display compared to a more realistic tactical map. Let me show you something else. So what about a character who's like a scientist, or a character that's more cerebral, right, in a sci-fi game? In a fantasy game like D&D, for example, smart characters usually have some kind of magic or some other auxiliary capability. But in Eclipse Phase, how do you make science or any kind of stressful intellectual action interesting? So here's an example. Same game. This is the session last night. I had a character, kind of a scientist type, a smart character. How could I allow that character to experience a challenge in this kind of situation that was violent for some characters, but that character wasn't the kind of character that's going to jump into violence? So what does that character have to do? Well, I developed a scenario where they had to very quickly find a place to hide within the solar system. So without developing an overly complex system, I had the character make a research roll, coupled with a navigation roll later to try to find areas where they could hide out. And then I would show them something like this. All right, so a few systems went through the book, found a few cool places for this particular scenario that they might want to go to, threw them on the map. If you wanted to get granular, or if you wanted to add maybe a little more tactical options for something like this, but maybe only reveal a few of your destinations in a scenario like this, and for depending on the level of successes they rolled in Eclipse Phase, the measures of success, that would determine how many of these were revealed to them. So you can play with all kinds of cool, fun, clever systems. Again, my advice that I had to constantly remind myself was not to make these overly complicated. Don't start making up extra rules where there don't need to be any. A simple rule could suffice to show you enough of these options. But hey, we've taken an intellectual task, added a little bit of stress to it, a challenge, and it's still something that the player has to analyze, so we don't want to just roll the dice and boom, give you an answer. Let the character succeed, but use that success to make the player now have to make a choice, or have to think about this a little bit. This is the first time I've done anything like this particularly, and now my mind is running with ideas on how can you use visual tools to make intellectual or mental challenges more interesting to play through, especially in an online game, like something run on Roll20 like here. Let me show you another example. And this is something that I've always struggled with because I've been a fan of cyberpunk-like games my whole life. And I've always struggled with the idea of hacking. How do you make hacking interesting? In some games, like Cyberpunk 2020, for example, which I've played ever since I was a teenager, there's a hacking system. In that game, it's so tedious that players often ignore it. Groups will often ignore it, or they'll have simple rules and very much simplified mechanics to go through hacking. Eclipse Phase, hacking is a big part of it. There are rules for hacking, for subversion, for intrusion. But at the same time, they don't do a great job, the mechanics, I would say, of really telling a good narrative story. And I was thinking about that. How do I tell this visual idea? So here's a scenario. So this happened again in my session on Monday. I had a character. They were trying to hack into a Jovian ship. Right, so that's the scenario. Jovian ships aren't meshed, but they got computers. So in this particular story, the character was told that they could spacewalk outside the ship and plug in through a physical port. So they did. There was a cool dramatic scene involving the spacewalk. But once they got to the ship, they actually come upon the network. And here's what the network looks like. And actually what I had done is I had I had randomly rolled, put them in one of these locations, and I actually used Fog of War to hide everything except the place that they were within that network, at least initially. So let me do that here to show you what that kind of looked like. So let me turn on my Fog of War. Let me reset my fog. So there's my character. I'm going to reveal the area just around them. Okay. So the character hacked into this network. They are in some kind of computer or system called arrays. And these are the various things they can do. Well, what can they do? They can access these systems that I thought of a few. For each of the systems that the character could break into, I thought of a few functions that might be helpful given that character's goal. And there's also a bad guy for the character to fight. In this case, an automated sentry AI designed to guard each of these systems. So that way there can be an opposed intrusion test for that character to break into that system. Once they were inside, they could run a scan, simple interface roll, and depending on the result of their scan, I could reveal more of the network. Right? So now they can see that if they want to advance to another part of the network, they have to break through another firewall, let's say. And I do have stats for both the AI sentries and the firewall. Add a little more challenge. Let's say the character is able to scan the entire network, or was in that. In fact, they were in the game last night. They could discover that it's a much larger network. Depending on how much they wanted to go into it, they could spend a lot of time in this network, right? Doing various things. This is the first time I've ever tried anything like this, a way to visually represent a hack, not just in Eclipse Phase, but in any other kind of sci-fi game like this. Usually it's just very descriptive, right? And I talked to the player after the game, and they seemed to react well to it. They enjoyed it. I think I want to use this idea again in some capacity. I think I'm going to tweak it a little bit. I want to think about how I can make these various networks that some of my hacker characters might try to involve themselves in or break into, whatever. How can I make them more complex, more interesting, right? Eventually, if I keep on doing this same very simple architecture over and over, it could get boring. And again, I want it to tell a visual story. Maybe in this case, because it's a Jovian network, the topology of this network is very structured and very tree-like. But maybe in a Brinker computer network, it's much less structured. Maybe it's more of a beehive shape, or you can play with all kinds of fucking cool ideas for how a network might look and how a hacking character might interact with that. So those are a few of the things that I tried in my Eclipse Phase session, and I thought I'd share those with you. Why? Because if we have tools as immersive, imaginative storytellers, if we have tools that allow us to use visuals and audio assets, and not just our narrative capabilities, which we should all as storytellers have, well-developed narrative capabilities. But let's also try to use visuals where we can. Why? Because not every player reacts well to the same type of medium, right? Just like when you're learning, not every person learns in the same way. People are more attuned to visual things, to audio input, to reading sometimes, to listening to people talk, to doing things, right? To playing with tokens or playing with something on a screen. And in order to ensure that all of our players are getting the most experience from our sessions, we want to make sure that we include as many of those other things as possible, right? Diversify the way you tell your story, so that way you're engaging as many of your players as you possibly can. Obviously, if you know your players well, you want to hit those things, right? That you know your characters gravitate well towards. But play around with other ways of storytelling, right? Storytelling, immersive storytelling, the way I think it's meant to be done. It's not just a storyteller talking, and it's certainly not just a map, right? We're not playing a video game. We're creating a story together. We're imagining a scenario together as the storyteller and players to combine. So think about that. Thanks for listening to me ramble. If you have any ideas, if you tried something similar, let me know. I'd love to hear about those. And if you like this idea, use it and tell me whether it worked or not in your game. Feel free to comment. And I hope some of you try some of these ideas, such as a kind of sci-fi tactical map, right? Or a visual way to represent a technical or mental challenge. Think about that. I'm going to think about it more too, and I'm going to come up with more ideas, more mental challenges and ways to visually represent those during a session. And as soon as I come up with more and use them, I'll share them with you as well, whether they succeeded or failed, because some of these ideas I'm sure will fail. But in the meantime, happy gaming. Again, let me know if you try these. I'll catch y'all later. Sci-Magrins out.